welcome our speaker to the podium today. And it's dear Douglas again. I've known him for many years. He's a sweet light worker from, I met up at Harmony Grove. And I had him on my ministerial weekends help with healing and messages. And I'm just so blessed to know him. He's traveled all over and brings back such great information of cultures and ceremonies and all their stuff going on. Douglas Barker, metaphysical teacher, light worker, art history instructor, and passionate world traveler. 14 years residence in Europe changed his life forever. And his major influences were Alan Watts, Rudolf Steiner, who's trained in his alternative education system, the Waldorf schools, Osho, who became a disciple, diploma in astrological counseling from a school in Switzerland, initiation as a priest of Wicca, and initiation in the use of the sacred Native American pipe. 4 years residence in Sedona, ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru, and certificates in mediumship and hands-on healing from Harmony Grove Spiritualist Association. And most recently, the Hawaiian shamanism. Douglas is working today with Tarot, and mediumship, goddess cards, and shaman stones. And let's welcome warmly, please, Douglas Barker.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, I'm going to first of all ask, how many of you good folks have ever had a reading with tarot cards? Good. How many of you have given readings with tarot cards? Okay, good. Well, the tarot, as you know, is an enormous subject, and simply to describe it, I'm just going to give a very brief description. It's a deck of 78 cards, 22 of which are called the major arcana, or the major secrets, the other 56 being the minor arcana. The major arcana deals with archetypes of human experience, universals, and the minor arcana more with everyday type events, but the two parts fit together perfectly. Now, 78 is not a sacred number, and you wonder how this actually came about, and it seems that one of the most fascinating things about the tarot is the mystery of where it actually came from and how it developed. And that is going to be my topic today, the story of the tarot. Now, many of you have probably heard these myths that back in the time of Egypt, sometimes they put it all the way back to Atlantis, that the culture was about to fall. And so a group of wise men got together and someone came up with the idea that they would put their wisdom in a deck of playing cards. Well, that's a little bit impossible, considering that papyrus frays at the edges and parchment wrinkles and bends, and you couldn't make playing cards out of those, and they didn't have them in those days anyway. And so the story actually begins in China in the year AD 105. This was during the time of the Han Dynasty. The emperor had eunuchs at court who performed various functions, and one of them was a very clever man by the name of Cai Lun. And in that year, by using the inner bark of the mulberry tree, he perfected the process of making paper from wood pulp, an extremely important invention. But as is typical in China, often they would not exploit an invention for many years to come. And in the case of paper, it seems nobody really did anything with it until about the 7th and 8th centuries during the time of the Tang Dynasty, which was one of China's golden ages. Now then they started producing such things as paper money, also cards, including greeting cards, and cards for gaming. Originally, the Chinese have always been avid gamblers, and they were originally using banknotes, and eventually they switched over to cards, which actually were long and thin and resembled the banknotes. The games of cards, the decks actually consisted of two versions. One of them was a three-suited variety in which you had from 1 to 9 in each of the three suits, which were called strings of coins. And then you had myriads of strings, a string being 10,000. And it was all based on the idea of coins, in other words, because it was a gambling game. There was also a four-suited variety that had tens of myriads. And it was this one that began to migrate to the west along the Silk Route, where they would have to skirt the wastes of the Taklamakan Desert and arrive in the fabled city of Samarkand, where it was taken up into Persia. Now, ever since 651, the Persians have been part of the Islamic Empire, and so when cards reached the Persia, they very quickly spread through the entire Islamic realm. But the suits had changed in the meantime. They kept the suit of coins, but they now had suits of golden chalices, scimitars, those curved Arabic swords, and finally, what's the other? Wands, yes. Polo sticks. The game came from Central Asia. So they were possibly changed by the Sufis, the mystics of Islam, because part of their teachings involved even Western teachings of the four elements. And as you can see, they fit perfectly. The polo sticks were fire, the chalices were water, the scimitars were air, and the coins were earth. Now, the game was actually called in Arabic Naib, which meant a deputy. And they had court cards as well. The original court cards in China were red flower, white flower, and old thousand. And they changed in the Islamic realm because they couldn't depict human beings in Islamic art. So you had a king, a vizier, and a second vizier, or an advisor. But of course they didn't have pictures on them of these people. Now, because the Europeans often fought with Islamic countries, but they traded with them a great deal as well. And so it seems that in the 1360s and 70s, decks of cards began to appear in Spain and Italy. Now, they had no idea what polo was until the English brought the game back from India in the 18th century. So they straightened the sticks out and made them batons or wands. Now, the court cards became a king, a knight, and a squire. And originally, because they didn't yet have the printing press, they had to print them by stencil. And they wore out quickly, but they were easily reproduced. And in Spain and Italy, even today, the original style of decks of cards uses those same four suit symbols, which are the four that are used in tarot today. And in Spain, from Naib, playing cards are called naipes. Now in 1371, we have the word naip appearing in a Catalan dictionary that was a rhyming dictionary. Catalunya is the northeastern part of Spain, and that's where Barcelona is located, which is probably the port city where the cards came in. In 1377, we find mention of them in Florence, and it was referred to in a document as, quote, a certain game called naibe, newly introduced in these parts. Now, in that same year, a German monk at a Swiss monastery wrote a description in Latin of the ludus cartorum, the game of cards, in which he gave a kind of description, although not detailed enough that we know exactly what they looked like. And in the same year again, cards were banned in Paris as well as in the city of Siena in Italy. And in fact, for the rest of the 14th century, there are about 20 mentions of cards, and most of them are bans on their use, particularly by workmen. In other words, after work, they were going down to the tavern and drinking and playing cards, and they were losing the money that they were supposed to bring home to feed their families. In 1378, the Bavarian city of Regensburg allowed cards to be played, but it limited the amount that they were allowed to wager, because of course they were always betting. Now, we also have our earliest known mention of a card game, but we still have the rules today. It comes from Germany from the 15th century. The game was called Karneval, which means literally hernia. Apparently it hurt to lose. Now, in 1440, this is during the early Renaissance in Italy, we have the first mention of naibi di trionfi, triumph cards. And then in the 1420s, it seems they had added a fifth suit of cards. Now, as you know, most card games are trick-taking games. What do you do when you can't follow suit? You play a trump card. Well, the 22 cards of the major arcana were added as a suit of trumps. So this was still purely a card game. It wasn't anything esoteric. During the 15th century, German printers, where it was a very highly developed art, experimented with all sorts of things, so they came up with other kinds of suits just to illustrate them. So one pack of cards had a suit of goats. One suit had a suit of harps. One even had a suit of frying pans. But of course, they didn't last very long because when people are playing cards, they're playing to win and they don't want to be deflected by what's interesting on the cards. Well, the word triumphs eventually became trumps. So it all comes from the word trionfo in Italian. Now, also in the 15th century, they added a fourth court card, a queen. And it was around the same time that in the game of chess, the king's vizier or advisor was changed to a queen. Apparently the status of women was now beginning to rise in Europe. Eventually, in playing cards, they dropped the knight altogether and they kept the queen, so that's why we have three court cards. Now, you might say, well, how on earth can this be esoteric? Because you're taking this card game and then you're adding these 22 cards to it. Well, look at playing cards, because they already have a cosmological significance. How many cards are in a deck of playing cards? 52. How many weeks are in a year? 52. You have 4 suits, the 4 seasons. 13 cards in each suit, an ace to 10 and 3 court cards. 13 number of lunar months in a year. And then, if you know anything about astrology, you have a king. You have, first of all, a knight originally charging on his horse. You had a king who sits on his throne until he dies. And then you have a gopher who carries out the orders. And those cards, they would be cardinal, fixed, and mutable in astrology, if you know anything about that. Okay. It was about 1441 that we have the very first surviving deck of cards. They were cards that were hand-painted in Milan for the Duke by Bonifacio Bembo, who was the court artist. Now that means they were kind of a luxury number. They didn't look like everyday playing cards. They were painted for the Duke, who was a member of the Visconti. Now, in 1450, another Duke has come to the throne after throwing the other one out, Francesco Sforza. And in that year, we have a notice in the annals of the court in which he requested that one of the underlings at the court go out into the city and buy some packs of cards that they could use for gaming. And he said, try to get the 78 card pack if you can, if not get the 52. Now, this teaches us already as a number of interesting things, is that number one, the cards were used for gaming. Number two, they were readily available in the marketplace. And number three, there was a distinction being made between the 78 card pack and the 52 card pack. Now, eventually, by the late 1400s, they had taken the 22 major arcana cards and numbered them, giving the fool the non-number of 0 and numbering the others from 1 to 21. In 1495, the French invaded Lombardy, where Milan is located, and they were there for about a quarter of a century. Now, what do soldiers do when there's nothing else going on? They play cards. And so they took cards with them back to France, where major manufactories turned up in Lyon and Marseille. Even today we have a Tarot of Marseille that is very popular. And that, in fact, is what Tarot cards pretty much look like, the earliest ones, like the Tarot of Marseille. Because they only call it the Tarot de Marseille when it was reprinted in the 1930s. Before that, they called that style Le Tarot Italien. So there you go. Now, in 1516, we have the first mention of the word tarot, and it's in its Italian form, and in plural because they refer to the cards as the plural. Itaroki. And there's been lots of ink spilled over where in the world did that word come from. And they've looked at all kinds of Arabic words trying to derive what it came from. But it seems that if you trace it back, it goes back to Latin. In Latin, there was a verb, alterocare, and that meant to dispute or to argue. It's where our word altercation comes from. Because people playing cards, it's kind of like a duel or a battle. And then it even shows up, for example, in a court of law, and then the defense attorney threw down his trump card. You can see how it fits. Okay, that's the end of part one. That's the origins of the minor arcana that you guys see came exactly from playing cards. Now, what about these major arcana, 22 cards, much more mysterious? For this, we go back to the city of Alexandria on the north coast of Egypt. Founded by Alexander the Great, there were loads of Greeks living in Egypt who retained their language but developed their own culture. And Alexandria, it was like the Sedona and Glastonbury of the ancient world. Everything existed there. It was just swarming with mystical and metaphysical sects, with a blending of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and early Christian influences. They even had Buddhist missionaries from India there at the time. Now, by this point, which was extremely late in Egyptian history, the priesthood had become decadent. And what they were doing is selling a lot of the things that they used to do. It was at this time that Pythagoras was able to go to Egypt, and even though he was a Greek, he was initiated over a period of 20 years into the Egyptian mysteries. And then he went to Sicily and started his own mystery school. Now, the priests were sometimes even Greek philosophers at the same time at this point. And the result was successive Roman emperors would ban magic because the priests would know the magic rites. They would continue to perform them, often in secret. And in fact, they would even do it for private patrons for a fee. And they used such things as what are known as the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. And these were handbooks for magicians. So we're coming up to what goes into the Tarot, so you know that something of the ancient wisdom of the Egyptian and Greek mysteries did flow into the deck. Now, you have to realize that there were many, many different types of metaphysical sects around this whole Eastern Mediterranean era at the time. Many of them were, for example, Gnostics. What they were aiming at was gnosis, meaning experiential knowledge, not something that they read in a book or were told by a teacher. And they could be pagan, they could be Jewish, or they could be Christian. But they were mystics, aiming at real experiences. Now, the Jewish Gnostics developed the Kabbalah, or the foundations of it, their version of mysticism and magic. And there were more Jews in Alexandria at the time than there were in Palestine. So there was a thriving Jewish culture there which could develop this. And you must remember that the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters in it. This will become significant. Now, other types of metaphysical groups were Hermetic. These were groups that practiced magic, astrology, alchemy, and so on. They revered the ancient Egyptian god who was known in Egypt as Tahuti, but among the Greeks, he became known as Thoth. Now, he was supposedly this great initiate or avatar who had been an earlier advisor to Egyptian kings and had then actually become a king himself. And he supposedly gave the Egyptians the hieroglyphs, the arts, and the sciences. And the priests at the time claimed that he had written down his magical instructions as the so-called, what the Greeks called the Book of Thoth. And the Greeks equated him with Hermes, their own god of wisdom, communications, and the alphabet. And so when they referred to this being, they used the ancient title of Great, 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 and called him in Greek Hermes Trismegistus, meaning Hermes the thrice great. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, Hermetic writings began to appear all over the place, and there were 19 of them that finally became grouped together as the Corpus Hermeticum. And these discussed mystical philosophy, astrology, alchemy, and magic. The writers were Greco-Egyptian, they were writing in Greek, and they ascribed their works to Hermes. Either you could say they channeled them, or it was based on oral traditions that had been handed down that they believed came from Hermes. In other words, a Greek book of Thoth. Now, one third group that was also widely popular and became more and more influential over the centuries, these were the Neoplatonists. Plato himself was a mystic, and his teachings were combined with other mystical systems, and eventually that would influence the Gnostics, the Kabbalists, the Hermetists, and later the Sufis, as well as Christian mystics. This was based because they had an interesting model of concentric circles, and the idea was emanations. Up at the very top you had God, and he would emanate, meaning sending a wave of evolution out from him, which would become various levels of spiritual beings. And each one would become a little more dense, you might say, until finally at the very end you got all the way down to earthly matter. Now, this idea of the 7 spheres of the planets and so on, that became part of Christian cosmology, among other things. And eventually it reached, interestingly, 22 stages, because each of them was associated with one of the 4 elements, the 7 known planets, the 9 ranks of angels, the world soul, and God at the very top. Now, Plato himself had described the wheel of the cosmos as a group of 8 spheres, concentric, the planets and the fixed stars. And he said that there was a descent into mortality. Part of the Neoplatonic philosophy was that all the way down to the bottom, you finally came to the individual human soul. But the soul could again climb up that ladder through the spheres until it reached God. This is the origin of the major arcana trump, the Wheel of Fortune. He also described a chariot with 2 winged horses. One of them was black and represented the soul of appetite. The other was white, represented the soul of will. And the driver represented reason, who kept them in check. There you have the origin of the chariot trump. Now, eventually you see the fool at the very beginning. He goes through 3 series of 7 encounters in life. And it represents what has been called a map of the soul from birth to enlightenment. Now, we have to look at triumphs. These are processional parades, triumphal parades, which go all the way back to the time of ancient Rome. When there would be a great Roman victory, there would be a triumphal procession. So first you would have the captives walking in front. They would be followed by the soldiers, then the officers would come after them, and finally at the very end was the commanding general in his chariot. Each of the successive parts of the parade had triumphed over the one right in front of them. And these things became very popular. In Italy, they were performed at religious processions and sometimes at funerals to show the victory of the soul at the end over death. And in Renaissance Italy, the custom was just going everywhere. And there they would dress the figures in elaborate costumes who would represent allegorical figures. And often the fool would come right at the beginning, the same as he does in the major arcana. And the participants would represent the temperaments, the elements, virtues, fates, planets, gods, goddesses, and death. And examples of this began to appear in literature as well.
Douglas?
Yes. Oh. So the origin of the cards really is, the organizing principle is the triumph of the soul. And the chariot card was sometimes called Il Carro Triunfale, the triumphal chariot. And people in the Renaissance would often use series of cards to teach their children about cosmology and morals and things like that. So everything was set. And then the major arcana was added and it became part of the tarot. And the last part is when it became occult. Nobody had ever written anything about the tarot being that mystical or esoteric until 1781. A French Freemason wrote an article in which he said that it came from ancient Egypt and the gypsies brought it to Europe and all sorts of myths, but this was the beginning of it. And then it was taken up in the 19th century by various mystical groups, especially the Golden Dawn in England, who used the tarot and the Kabbalah as the whole basis of the system symbolically. And in fact, the 3 most popular decks in the 20th century were Aleister Crowley's Thoth Tarot, Paul Foster Case's Builders of the Adytum Tarot, and A.E. Waite's Tarot that we know today as the Rider-Waite-Smith. And all three of those men were, of course, members of the Golden Dawn. A.E. Waite's Tarot was illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith, who did an excellent job. She was never really given the recognition in life that she deserved, and when she died in 1951, she was living in poverty. But even to this present day, her tarot is considered really the standard. And with that, I will close my talk.
Awesome.